Welcome, everyone, to another exciting class in our series on the Second Temple period. And tonight, what we're going to be talking about is the end of prophecy. I'm going to start by saying that, of course, there is a rabbinic tradition. We're going to see not just a rabbinic tradition. There's a tradition that prophecy ends with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Right? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. That they are our last prophets. And the question is, are they? Are they in fact our last prophets? What does this mean? Why are they our last prophets? And so we're going to start by looking at some biblical sources to see why prophecy was problematic. And then we're going to take a look at some of the sources in our period of the return to Zion and that show us kind of the shaky nature of prophecy in this period. And finally, we're going to take a look at some Second Temple sources that look and see how, after the return to Zion, prophecy was viewed and wasn't viewed as having ended or still continuing. Okay, so let's jump in. Let's start with a story in Melachim and Kings, in First Kings, Melachim Aleph, that really kind of highlights the ancient problem with prophecies. So in this account, and many of you I think are probably familiar with it, we have the king of Israel, who in this story is not named, and Jehoshaphat, who is the king of Judah, Yehuda, and the two of them are going to go to battle together. And Jehoshaphat, who seems a little bit more godly in this story, he says, the king of Israel said, before we go to battle, let's ask a prophet. Let's ask the word of God. Drosh na chayom et dvar Hashem. And I'm reading from 1 Kings 22, verse 5, Melachim Aleph Chaf Bet Hey. Says, let's ask God first. So what does the king of Israel do? No problem. He's got 400 court prophets. I've got guys on my payroll, no problem. 400 prophets. He says, should we march against Ramoth Gilead? Or not? And they say, Vayomru ale v'yitein Hashem biyad hamelech. They say, go up because God is going to give them into the hand of the king. And Jehoshaphat is wary. Why is he wary? He's probably wary because all of them are saying the same thing. There are 400 of them. They're court prophets. He's like, can I rely on these guys? So he says, Vayomer Jehoshaphat, ha'en po navi la'Adonai od v'nidrasha me'oto. He says, Jehoshaphat says, is there no other prophet of God that we can ask? And the king of Israel says, there's one guy, but I hate him. I hate him. He's always saying crappy prophecies to me. I don't like him. His name is Michaihu ben Yimla. This is the first time we've heard about this guy, but this guy is Michaihu ben Yimla. And Jehoshaphat says, oh, don't say that, right? He says, Ayomar HaMelech, don't say that. Don't say you hate this prophet. So they're like, okay, let's bring him over. They get an officer to bring him over. They're seated. All the prophets are prophesying. Hanavim mitnabim lifneihem. Mitnabim usually means that they're in the middle of like an ecstatic prophetic experience, all these prophets, which already should make us a little bit hesitant to rely on them. Because the presence of ecstatic prophecy has kind of a mixed meaning, a mixed connotation in biblical texts. So all of the prophets are prophesying the same way. They're all saying, go up, Ale Ramoth Gilead Vatzlach, go up to Ramoth Gilead and you're going to be successful. God is going to give him over. And the messenger tells Michaihu, he's like, listen, all of them are prophesying this way. You better prophesy this way. Say a good thing. He's the king, right? And Michaihu says, I'm going to say only what God tells me. And in fact, what happens is the king asks him, should we go against Ramoth Gilead? And he says, he says, go up and be successful. God will give it to the hand of the king. He's using the exact words of all the other prophets. And the king knows he's mocking him. And the king says, he says, how many times do I make you swear to only speak the truth? And then he says, I see a bad defeat coming. Right? And he describes the defeat. He's like, they're all going to be scattered like sheep without a shepherd. And then the king of Israel turns to the king of Judah and he says, didn't I tell you this guy always gives me crappy prophecies? Didn't I tell you? This guy can't say a good word about me. All right. So that's a classic story that shows us the difference between a prophet of God and the court prophets. There are court prophets that they say what the king wants to hear. On the other hand, you can't rely on them. However, you also have these true prophets who will say what the truth is. And we see this in the way Amos presents himself. And this is the famous, am I in the right place? Where Amos has to explain who he is, right? Because he is told, Amos is a prophet that's possibly actually originally from Yehudah. He's prophesying in the land of Israel. And Amaziah, who is the priest, says to him, don't prophesy here because this is a place for a king. Okay, he says, Brach lecha al eretz Yehudah v'chol sham lechem v'sham tinarveh. He says, go, run away to the land of Yehudah, eat bread there and prophesy there. In other words, they get a salary from them. You're not going to get a salary here because we don't like what you're saying. And also the king is going to come after you. And Amos's answer is, Lo navi anochi v'lo ven navi anochi. I'm reading from Amos Zion, Amos 7:14, verse Pasuk Yudalit. Lo navi anochi v'lo ven navi anochi ki boker anochi u'v'lei shikmim. He says, no, you don't understand. I don't just prophesy where the bread is, right? That's not my job. I'm not a professional prophet, right? I am a cattle breeder. I deal with sycamore fig trees. God took me away from the sheep. God took me away from my regular job, and he said, listen, you got to say this stuff. In other words, I'm not a prophet. I'm a real prophet. I'm not a professional prophet. I am an amateur, but a true amateur. And so we see the difficulty of believing who is a true prophet during this period when there are professional prophets. And of course, where you never know who to believe. So if we look at Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu Chavchet, I'm reading from Yirmiyahu Chavchet, Jeremiah 28, we remember the story. God says to him he has to walk around with a yoke on his neck. And that yoke on his neck is symbolizing the fact that Judea should remain under the yoke of Babylon. They should not rebel, okay? He's walking around with this yoke on his neck, and there's this prophet Hananiah, the son of Azur. And in the beginning, for us to not know, it just calls him the prophet. Hananiah ben Azur Hanavi, right? Hananiah, the son of Azur, he's the prophet from Gibon. And he says, God says, I'm going to break the yoke of the king of Babylon. And he takes the yoke from Yirmiyahu's neck and he breaks it. Okay? Yirmiyahu's saying if we rebel against Babylon, bad things are going to happen. At the same time, Hananiah is saying God is promising that he's going to break the yoke of Babylon. And Yirmiyahu says, what did he say? He doesn't say you're lying. He says, Amen. Ken yaseh Hashem, yakem Hashem et dvarecha. He says, so may God do. May God do what you're saying. Asher nibeta, that you prophesied, lashiv klei beit Hashem v'chol hagolah mibavel el makom hazeh, that you're saying that all of the vessels have already been taken from that temple, and all the people who have already been exiled will return. And then he explains to him, but listen, the rule is that if you prophesy a good thing and it doesn't come true, and if you prophesy a bad thing and it doesn't come true, that just means that people repented and God was merciful. But if you prophesy a good thing and it doesn't come true, that means you're a false prophet. He explains to this prophet. This is the first time, by the way, we're hearing this rule. Now we take this rule for granted. But the fact is, Yirmiyahu doesn't know he's lying. Yirmiyahu has no way of knowing if this guy's lying or not. Because remember, especially since that's the rule, if that's the rule, the fact that God is telling Yirmiyahu bad things doesn't mean they're going to come true. Because people could repent and God could just be merciful. Hananiah could be speaking the truth. He doesn't know. And then afterwards, there's a prophecy that God says that Hananiah, that this is when, and then Hananiah breaks the yoke. And then God says to Yirmiyahu, listen, Hananiah you should tell Hananiah, no, your prophecy is not going to come true. And then Yirmiyahu says, listen, God didn't send you, you're lying, right? You are misleading people by lying. Because then Yirmiyahu knows because God told him. This is the classic problem of prophecy, right? The classic problem of prophecy, if you're in a world that believes in prophecy, is that you never know who to believe. You don't know, is this a true prophet? Is this a false prophet? Is the fact that everyone's saying the same thing, does that make them true prophets or false prophets? In fact, this is, I believe, in a letter from Queen Shiptu to King Zimri Lin, right? In the Mari letter. So that's really, really old. Just like 1775 BCE, right? Around. And she writes to him and she's like, hey, I got an oracle that you're going to be successful in battle. And she says to him, and she says, and listen, you don't believe them. I'm telling you, they all said the same thing and they were all prophesying separately. And I'm telling you, you can believe it, right? Because you didn't know. You get an oracle, you get a prophecy, you don't know whether to believe it or not. However, certainly during the First Temple period, a prophet speaks and the tendency is to believe them. The idea is that part of God's gift to the people of Israel is that he sends prophets to tell them things. And part of the punishment is when prophecy dries up and when prophecy ends. One of Amos's prophecies for the future punishment is that everyone will be thirsty for the word of God and they will not be able to find it. It'll be too late because they've turned the prophets away. So there's this idea that one should still believe prophets. However, we see in our period in Shivat Zion that this is changing. Let's take a look at Nehemiah and how Nehemiah kind of gives us a view of the very complicated state of prophecy during, at least for Nehemiah's time. So let's jump in to Nehemiah. Okay, so I'm looking now at Nehemiah Vav, Nehemiah 6. I'll just do this kind of quickly, give you some background here. So Nehemiah has been building the wall around the city. This is his big project that he's been battling all sorts of enemies to do. Sanballat, Tovia, Geshem, and Geshem are very much against this. They're trying to do something to possibly harm him. At least that's the way Nehemiah sees it. They're saying, hey, let's have a meeting. Nehemiah's like, yeah, I don't think so. I think they want to do something bad to me in this meeting. He says, no, I'm really busy. I can't come. Okay. They sent him the same message over and over. And then they said, listen, we heard that you guys are planning to rebel. That's why you're building the wall. And what have you done? V'gam nevi'im hemata likro alecha b'Yerushalayim lemor melech b'Yehuda. V'ata yishama lamelech kadvarim ha'ele v'ata lecha v'nevi'atza yachdav. What have you also done? You've also set up prophets. In other words, you've paid off. What does that mean? You've set up prophets. You've paid off prophets. You've got prophets in your hire that are going to declare that you're the king, that you are the king in Judah. And now we're going to tell the king that you did this stuff. Nehemiah is not cowed. He's like, I'm not going to bow to this blackmail. It's a lie. Okay. None of these things that you're saying have happened. I'm not scared of you. We see already one kind of view of prophecy that they're like, hey, you've gotten prophets to say that you're the king. Well, he hasn't done any such thing, but the idea is that is something that one would do. And then he visits someone named Shmaya ben Delaiah ben Meheya Tavel. Now, whenever we have this, we have a 3-generation. We're supposed to know who this guy is. This guy's an important guy. He's from an important family. You and I don't know who he is, but the original reader is supposed to know who this person is. So he visits this guy, Shmaya, and he is housebound. I want to assume that he is sick in some way. For some reason, he can't leave the house, but it doesn't sound like he's imprisoned. Vayomer niva'ed el beit Elohim el toch ha'heichal v'nisgera daltot ha'heichal ki ba'im lahargecha v'layla ba'im lahargecha. And he says, listen, they're going to come to kill you tonight. So let's go and meet in the temple precinct, and we'll close the doors so they can't get you because they're coming to kill you tonight. And Nehemiah says, I should flee. I should come into the temple and live. There seems to be 2 parts of it. I should not be seen fleeing from my enemies, and I also should not be going and staying overnight in the temple precinct. I am not going to do that. Va'akira v'hinei lo Elohim shlachko ki hanivu'ah diber alai v'tovia v'sambalat scharo. I knew, now this is the first we're hearing of this, that this was a prophecy. I knew that God didn't send him because he spoke a prophecy to me. Rather, Tovia and Sanballat hired him. Okay, leman sachorhu, leman ira v'seke v'chatati. He said they hired him. He was hired so that I should fear and that thus I should sin. So this person who apparently he respected enough to visit spoke a prophecy to him, and Nehemiah said, you are lying. I know you are lying. You are not speaking a true prophecy. So here we see that at least in the time of Nehemiah, at least in the world of Nehemiah, which is a very political world, prophets are not particularly trusted. There are people who are saying they're prophets, and there are people who are saying prophecies, and it seems like the assumption is, I don't know if this guy's for real. The assumption is not to trust them. Okay. And then we go on. It says, right, like it says, I should actually start with the beginning of this verse. I'm reading from verse 14. So it's 6:14. Zechariah Elohai letovia lusanbalat kemasav ele v'gam lenoadia haneviah uliyeter haneviim asher hayu miyarim oti. Remember, God, remember these deeds against Tovia and Sanballat, and also against Noadia the prophetess, and the other prophets who were all trying to scare me. So he has all these prophets, apparently, who are all saying things that, oh no, they're going to hurt you. You shouldn't do this. And he's like, they are all liars. They've all been hired. Okay. So again, Nehemiah is living in a fairly, he's pretty paranoid, but like, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And that's certainly true in Nehemiah's case. He's got real enemies. And he's like, I don't believe any of these prophets. And he doesn't have any hesitation in not believing the prophets. He's like, they are clearly hired. They're clearly lying. God, remember this against them. And so we see similarly when we look at the end of Zechariah, towards the end of Zechariah, and it's a section that we read 2 weeks ago, where it's talking about in the future, people will be ashamed to say that they are prophets. I see there's some chats. Oh, so let me actually take a pause because I see Eliza wrote a note here that in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, it says how to tell a false prophet, right? That if what they say doesn't come true, then they're a false prophet. The problem is what happens so for example, we have Yonah, right? Yonah says a prophecy doesn't come true. He says 40 days, Nineveh napachad, and Nineveh is destroyed. Does it come true? It does not come true because they repent, right? So there's absolutely a view of prophecy that it doesn't have to come true. So in that case, how do you know? Not only that, those of you who heard the Haftorah this past week, the Haftorah of Va'era, noticed that we got to hear a prophecy that didn't come true. It's the prophecy that says that Egypt will fall to Babylon. It's a prophecy that follows another prophecy that doesn't come true. These are from Yechezkel, where he said that Tyre was going to fall. Tyre and Sidon were going to fall to Babylon, and they don't. And we know they didn't because it says in this prophecy, not prophecy against Egypt, that they did not. So there we have two prophecies in a row from Yechezkel that don't come true. Yet Yechezkel is considered a true prophet. Why do they not come true? Who knows? Deal with it, right? We keep them in the book and it's like, hey, they didn't come true. Deal with it. The fact is that we can have what's written in Devarim. It's very nice. But that is not generally always the way the prophets were judged. And especially if they were prophesying what we call poranut, they're prophesying something bad happening. If they're prophesying something bad happening and it doesn't come true, that doesn't mean they're a false prophet, right? And that, I'm not going to bring it now because we get into this whole other thing, but in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah 24, where we have the court case against Yirmiyahu, that is the argument. The argument is just because he says, because they say, you must be a false prophet if you're prophesying the destruction of the temple. And then they're like, wait, but Micha prophesied the destruction of the temple and it didn't get destroyed because everyone repented. So it's okay. It doesn't mean he's a false prophet. They still don't think the temple will be destroyed, but that doesn't mean he's a false prophet. And so we don't really have super easy ways to tell. And even if a prophet is saying something good is going to happen, there's a very long time range within which it could happen. It's not so easy to tell if someone's true or not. But as we just saw, at least for Nehemiah, there's a tremendous amount of doubt already. Are these prophets speaking the truth? And at least for Nehemiah, it's not even doubt. He seems to have almost an assumption that if they're saying something that he doesn't like, they are not speaking the truth. So let's take a look at Zechariah. Zechariah is talking about, of course, the end time, and we're in what again the academics call Deutero-Zechariah. This is a later. This is not necessarily coming from the time before the temple is rebuilt. he says part of removing the names of the idols, I'm going to remove the names of the idols from the land. I will also have the prophets and spirit of impurity removed from the land. Now, it doesn't say false prophets. Of course, it means false prophets. However, all it says is prophets. And I think that the reason that at this point, all it has to say is prophets, again, this seems to be a text that's later from when the original times that Zechariah is prophesying, that at this point, prophets are more often assumed to be false than not. So all it has to say is, I'm going to remove the prophets. Vayaki nave ish od, v'amru elav aviv v'imo yoldav lo techia, ki sheker dibarta, b'shem Adonai udkaru avihu v'imo yoldav binavo. As soon as he prophesies, his father and mother will say, you are not going to live because you lie. You're lying in God's name. And they will stab him to death because it will be so clear that he's speaking a false prophecy. Now, again, here it's clearly talking about false prophets, but it's just saying prophet over and over. Right? In those days, those prophets will be ashamed of their visions. They won't wear the standard kind of hair shirt so that they can deny being prophets. He says, no, I am not a prophet. I just work the land. I've been kind of like, I even work for other people. What are these strikes between your shoulders? Again, because they would strike themselves in order to get into a state of ecstatic prophecy. And he's just like, no, I've been beaten, with some kind of weird encounter in my friend's house, right? In other words, he'll rather say something shameful than saying that he prophesied. So this seems to say there's an assumption here that all prophets essentially are false. So we've gotten to the point where things have kind of fallen apart in terms of believing in prophets. So I want to show you for a second. So in terms of this tradition that we have that prophecy ends at Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, we do have things to point at biblically and say, yeah, we can see that after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, there is a doubt in terms of the truth of prophecy. So we already see the prophecy falling apart. Is it that black and white? It's not that black and white. I want to show you some things. So first of all, of course, we still have the expectation that in future prophecy will return, right? So if we look at Yeshayahu Memdala, that's Isaiah 44, right? We have, and there, I know there are different ways to interpret this, but it says, Ki atzak mayim al tzameh v'nozlim al yabasha etzok ruchi al zarecha uvirchati al tzetzaecha, because just as I pour water for the thirsty and liquid on the dry land, I am going to pour my spirit on your children and my blessing on your descendants. So you can say, well, spirit could just mean blessing. It just be parallel to blessing. But it does seem to be very much like we have in Joel, Perek Gimel, chapter 3, this idea of the Spirit of God will be on everyone to allow them to prophesy. It actually seems to be mirroring this verse in Joel. Vayach after it's also in the end time. I am going to pour my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your elders will dream dreams. Your young people will see visions. Even on the slaves, I'm going to pour my spirit. And I do think that in this case, it means slaves because it's talking about from the highest to the lowest, everyone is going to essentially have this kind of prophecy, right? So this idea of in the end time, and by the way, the time of when is Yoel written is a big question. We don't actually have a date for the book of Joel, the book of Yoel. It talks in a time when it talks about exiles. It talks about people who have been exiled, and it talks about a temple and it's clearly reflecting a time when there's a temple standing. So it's not clear, when it talks about exiles, is it talking about exiles because of the Assyrian conquest, or is it actually later? We don't know. So, but at any rate, there is this hope for prophecy. So, how does this play out once we get later into the Second Temple period? And because this is a topic that really kind of carries through in terms of does prophecy end or doesn't prophecy end? Did it end or didn't it end? In the time of Nehemiah, realize that Nehemiah is speaking long after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, right? One assumes Malachi, because Malachi, we don't know exactly when he prophesied, but it seems like Nehemiah is speaking long after they are gone. And yet he's relating to prophets and a prophet, and at least one prophetess, right? So there are people who are considered prophets at the time of Nehemiah. What seems to have changed is that they're not trusted much. It's not the same thing. No one has to disprove them. Rather, they have to prove themselves. So let's take a look and see how later Second Temple texts deal with the issue of prophecies and prophets. I'm going to pause for any questions or comments.
Isn't
Yes.
it a little bit weird that Zechariah is giving a prophecy in which he's bad-mouthing prophecy and saying that it's the scourge of the earth, and when the times are better, we won't have any prophets?
It is a little weird. One of the possibilities that really comes out from this kind of is that there's so many people prophesying. Like maybe at this time, or when, and remember, this is probably the end of Zechariah. In other words, I do kind of tend to think this is a later period in some way, but maybe this period there are just like this tremendous number of people prophesying that is actually really creating a problem. And so in the future, you won't have this crazy thing where everyone's like, hey, I'm a prophet, I have the word of God, listen to me. Zechariah himself, if we look at the beginning of the book, a lot of his prophecies are kind of distant visions. Like he'll go to an angel and the angel says, oh, look at this. And the angel's explaining things to him. There are a lot of things where he's not getting it directly from God and he doesn't understand what he sees. There's already this idea that he's not getting things directly the way the old prophets did, right? There's already more of a feeling that God is kind of distant. You can talk to angels. You can get kind of explanations from angels, but it's much, much less likely to get direct prophecy from God. Right. So there's already this idea, particularly in Zechariah, you have this kind of dilution of prophecy. And so it's not that strange that at the end, it's like, yeah, there are all these people who are saying they're getting the word of God and they're clearly lying. You're not going to have that anymore. And also it may be coupled with the phenomenon of ecstatic prophecy. The only reason to say that is because it's talking about the marks on between their shoulder blades, right? Why do they have these marks? Well, why are they beating themselves? It's to get into some kind of ecstasy in order to receive prophecy. And that is something that biblically there are very different attitudes towards, is that real prophecy or not? In terms of there are different attitudes that we see in different books of, is ecstatic prophecy real prophecy? Is it for real? Right? And certainly Zechariah doesn't describe going into an ecstatic prophecy, and it could be that that's also part of what this is arguing against. So now let's go into the Second Temple sources.
More question. You think that this sense of being more distant from God also just might have been the result of exile, and just the destruction made people feel like their connection to God is not
I
like
think that's a good point. I think it's a good point. But even if so, it took a while. Like Yechezkel, Ezekiel, he's speaking outside of the land of Israel. He's speaking after the initial exile, and he's still saying, God spoke to me. And you have Yeshai, like there are prophets saying God spoke to me. Like in Haggai, God speaks to him, right? And again in Zechariah also. So I think though that the whole way people are thinking about different things is changing, is shifting. So yeah, I think it makes sense that would have added to the feeling of God being distant. But I think people are just a little bit more skeptical. I think people aren't living in a world anymore where the spiritual / theological is real the way it used to feel to them. That would be kind of my guess. I think that they're much like, I don't think they think they're seeing miracles. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think there's a lot of things that they're not seeing that maybe the ancients did feel that they were seeing miracles. They did feel that they were seeing direct godly intervention and things. And I think worldviews have kind of changed already at this point. I mean, realize how late we are at this point compared to earlier thought, and how much people have gone through in terms of thinking as well. But yeah, but I think that's a good point, that the exile itself could make them feel more distant from God. And how can we don't, God's just not that close to us anymore. Anyway, so let me jump into some of our Second Temple texts. Here we are. And I'm going to give you the approximate dates of all of these. Okay. So in the book of First Maccabees, that's a book that was written originally in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. We have it in Greek as part of the Septuagint. And it was actually written and edited after all of the Maccabean Wars were over. And so here's talking about after the death of Yehuda Maccabee. So in around 160 BCE, there was a lot of lawlessness. And the point here that I brought, this is for this last sentence here. And there was a great affliction in Israel, such as had not been since the day that a prophet was not seen among them. In other words, already you're talking about, we're in the Hasmonean period. They're like, there's no more prophecy. We haven't seen a prophet since forever, right? So where it's already clear in this book, at least, that there's no more prophecy. Second Baruch is a book that's written after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, so we're talking about more after 70 CE. And it says, but now the righteous have been gathered and the prophets have fallen asleep. We too have left our land and Zion has been taken from us, and we have nothing now except for the Mighty One and his Torah. So again, there are no more prophets.
Who is Torah? And why do we have this?
So Second Baruch is what is actually a classic example of pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha, we use the term to mean any book that did not make it into the Hebrew Bible or the Apocrypha, but we call it the Jewish pseudepigrapha, are Jewish books written in the Second Temple period, more or less, that did not make it into the Apocrypha or the Bible. However, pseudepigrapha literally means written under a false name, right? So Baruch is written under a false name. It is attributed to Baruch, who is the scribe of Yirmiyahu. It is not, of course, written by Baruch, the scribe of Yirmiyahu, and it is actually composed after the fall of the Second Temple, as opposed to after the fall of the First Temple. This is Second Baruch. And then in Josephus, who of course writes after also the fall of the Second Temple, he says, he's explaining the books of the Bible. And he says, from Artaxerxes to our time, the complete history has been written, but has not been deemed worthy of equal credit with the earlier records because of the failure of the exact succession of the prophets. In other words, he says, the prophets subsequent to Moses wrote the history of the events of their own time in 13 books. The remaining 4 books, like Tehillim and Mishlei, Psalms and Proverbs, contain hymns to gods and precepts for the conduct of human life. So what he's saying is, okay, the prophets were writing all the other books. Then when there were no more prophets, we couldn't have any more books in our Hebrew Bible. In other words, who are the last prophets? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, maybe Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Because they're also writing history books that are in the Hebrew Bible. And they're all hoping for the return of prophecy in the end time. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll kind of skip over this. But the idea is that in First Maccabees as well, it's hoping for prophets to come back. So we just saw a whole bunch of sources saying there's no more prophecy. And yet, there are prophets that are referred to, okay? So Josephus in Jewish Wars, he talks about he says 4 years before the war, when the city was enjoying profound peace and prosperity, there came to the feast at which it is the custom of all Jews to erect tabernacles before God, Sukkot. One, Jesus, in other words, Yeshua, that would be the standard. Jesus would be the standard name of anyone named Yehoshua. You wouldn't say Yehoshua, you'd say Yeshua, which would be transcribed as Jesus. One, Jesus, son of Ananias, a rude peasant, who standing in the temple suddenly began to cry out, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the 4 winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against all the people. Day and night he went about all the alleys with this cry on his lips. What is the implication? The implication is that this simple person somehow received prophecy foretelling the war and the destruction of the temple. And he also says, when he talks about the Essenes, he says there are some among them who profess to foretell the future, being versed from their early years in holy books, various forms of purification, and apophthegms of prophets, and seldom, if ever, do they err in their predictions. Okay, so he's saying they give predictions. They do things that you would normally think of as prophecies. right? He's not calling it really. He's saying of prophets. He's not quite calling it prophecy. He's calling it predictions, but he's saying they're doing things that are prophetic. What we have a lot more of in the Second Temple period is talking about false prophets, right? So in Qumran, they talk about their enemies as false prophets, right? The first thing here in Pesach Habakkuk is interesting because it's talking actually about how people outside the sect are bad because they don't believe how the leader of the sect interprets the words of the prophets. This is kind of how at Qumran they could kind of spin out what normally we would call prophecy by simply reinterpreting the words of the prophets and saying, no, this is what they really meant. In the Hodayot, we have a verse about coming to Nivi'e, L'doshecha mipi Nivi'e chazav, from the mouth of lying prophets, right? In other words, this is talking about people who are sinning against you, God. And they're listening to the stumbling block of their iniquity they have placed before themselves, and they come to inquire of you by means of the mouth of lying prophets who are themselves seduced by error. What it sounds like is there are people who are coming to people to lead them and perhaps even give them prophecy, and these are lying prophets. What's interesting is when do people at Qumran use the term prophets to mean someone contemporary? Only if they're lying prophets. They never call what they do prophecy. They don't call themselves prophets. They call what their enemies do lying prophecy. All right. So there's already this idea that no, there's no real prophecy anymore. And Josephus also talks about lying prophets that also were part of the cause of the tremendous conflict within the city of Jerusalem and among the Jews during the conflict with the Romans. And he talks about how there were deceivers and imposters under the pretense of divine inspiration, fostering revolutionary changes. They persuaded the multitude to act like madmen and led them out into the desert under the belief that God would there give them tokens of deliverance. And later on, he says, a still worse blow was dealt to the Jews by the Egyptian false prophet, a charlatan who had gained for himself the reputation of a prophet. This man appeared in the country, collected a following of about 30,000 dupes, and led them by a circuitous route from the desert to the mount called the Mount of Olives. So he's talking about people who are acting as prophets and are believed. Okay, so we can see a few things here. On the one hand, we see that in fact, there's a deterioration of belief in prophets after the return to Zion, right? After the initial return to Zion, as the Jews continue to live in their land, there is a determination that you don't really believe prophets. There are prophets walking around, but should you believe them? It seems to be okay to say, no, these guys are liars. Later on, we see that there seems to be a kind of an understanding that there are no more real prophets. We see that understanding at least in First Maccabees, which seems to be talking relatively early, like already in the Hasmonean period, that there are no more real prophets. Josephus, who's speaking much later than that, because he's speaking after the destruction of the Second Temple, is also saying there are no more prophets, and that prophecy ended with the sealing of the Hebrew Bible. That's why there are no more books of the Hebrew Bible. And yet, there are still people walking around calling themselves prophets that Josephus talks about. From Qumran, it's not clear if there are other people who are calling themselves prophets, or the Qumran sect wants to call them prophets because clearly they aren't prophets because there is no more prophecy. Right? And this way they're liars, right? However, we can see from Josephus that there are people who are walking around calling themselves prophets at different points. However, what used to be an assumed belief in the power of prophecy is gone. And yet there is still the hope that prophecy will return. That hope is from earlier biblical prophecy, this idea that in the end time, prophecy will be spread out, perhaps even to the masses, or at least that the prophets will return, because the prophets, the old prophets that we could believe in, were a gift from God that were refused because people didn't want to believe them. But at this point, there is no more prophecy. We see the kind of complex situation. There are prophets walking around, but we can understand why there's a belief that prophecy has ended, because people don't really believe in prophecy anymore the way they used to. So these prophets can be walking around, but it's very easy for Nehemiah, a leader, to say, no, you are a liar. You are a hired out hypocrite. And no one comes to him and says, Nehemiah, how dare you not listen to a prophet? No. Nehemiah is perfectly justified in saying this person is a lying hypocrite and a mercenary who wants to get me killed. And once you can say that easily about someone who is acknowledged by everyone as the prophet, once you can say that, then it seems that prophecy is really dead. So I think I tried to hear kind of explore what the state of prophecy is in this period and why we have a strong tradition of prophecy ending at Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi.
Miriam?
Any questions? Any comments? Yeah.
Miriam?
Yes.
Could you say, this is a very general question, that Dafka, the proliferation of prophets towards the end of the First Temple period and through the beginning of the Second Temple period, which the vast majority of which appear to have been false prophets, and the general difficulty in telling the difference between a true prophet and a false prophet, is what prompted Chazal very, very retroactively in Baba Batra to determine that, by the way, I think it seems to me that they're being intentionally vague whether they're talking about Beit Rishon or Beit Sheni. And the purpose of this, I can see as twofold. A, possibly to discredit Christianity. And secondly, to give a hechsher to the rabbinical leadership, which, unlike the Nevi'im, is led by mortal, fallible human beings who have machlokot between them.
But I hear what you're saying, but I want to point out that Qumran, where they absolutely weren't in the same line as Chazal,
Absolutely not, yeah.
They absolutely didn't say there's prophecy. Like, they were doing all sorts of things that we might call kind of part of prophetic work, but they were absolutely, no, what they were doing is not prophecy. There is no more prophecy. They're only false prophets. So I think the idea that there are only false prophets is not something that we should just hang on Chazal, right? In other words, there's this general feeling that no, in general, prophets are false prophets. And that is what I wanted. The reason I was showing things from earlier in the earlier biblical sources is because to show you that that's not always the way it was. A prophet could come up to Yirmiyahu and say, no, Yirmiyahu, you're wrong. Everything's going to be amazing. And Yirmiyahu doesn't know this guy's a liar until God tells him. He's like, well, I hope you're right. He doesn't say, how dare you, God told me something else. No, I don't know. I mean, there's maybe, because maybe they're going to repent.
I always understood that statement from Yirmiyahu to mean, halavai that you were right, with the implication that I know that you're obviously not right.
Look, I think he suspects he's not right, but he doesn't tell him he's a liar until God tells him he's a liar. Okay? Like, he tells him later, you're a liar, but he only does it after God says to Yirmiyahu, he's a liar, right? He doesn't say it to him right away. So for sure, he would love, like, oh, that would be great. And I do think he doubts him. I don't think that he says, oh, I bet this guy's for real, but he doesn't say he's a liar until he doesn't say he's a liar right away. He literally seems to not be sure until God tells him. And then he knows it because he knows how to say he's a liar. After God tells him, he's like, hey, buddy, you are a liar. So that's what makes me think that. What?
He couldn't have been sarcastic the first time?
Oh, sure, he could be sarcastic, but he's not going out to him and say, like, I'll tell you, if I were a prophet like Yirmiyahu, who was leading a miserable life because I'm busy walking around with a yoke around my neck because God told me, and some jerk of a prophet who says something everyone loves to hear is like, hey, you're a liar, you're wrong. I would just say, no, you're the liar, you're wrong, you're going to die, you false prophet, right? Okay, I'm not at Yirmiyahu's level, right? But like, I would be like, I wouldn't just be sarcastic. I wouldn't just be like, oh, well, we'll see who's right. I'm walking around with a yoke around my neck. And after God says to Yirmiyahu, hey, this guy's a false prophet, Yirmiyahu says to him, you know what? You're a liar. He's very, very straight. He could be sarcastic for sure. And he's absolutely telling him, hey, look, I sure as heck hope you're right, because if not, if you're a false prophet, it's going to be really bad, right? And you're setting yourself up to be a false prophet because you're saying good things. And if those don't come true, then you're false. I am safe because I'm saying horrible things. Those don't come true. Everyone just repented. I'm on velvet, right? So yeah, sure. You can absolutely say that he's being kind of sarcastic and funny, but he's not coming straight at him until God confirms that this guy's a false prophet. There's this idea of like, who do you believe? Do you just say someone's a liar? Like, and it seems, again, the default seems to be to believe rather than to disbelieve at that point. And that creates huge problems, obviously, because you have plenty of false prophets and it really creates a problem. But later on, I would argue, and this is an argument, you don't have to, I would argue that what happens later on is that the default becomes to not believe these guys. The default becomes, I don't believe you until there's something happens that makes me believe you. So once that's the default, then that's it for prophecy, pretty much. It's like, I don't think you're saying you're a prophet. I think you're lying. Like today, if someone came up to me and said he was a prophet, I'd be like, have you seen someone, right? Maybe, sit down, have a glass of water, right? So at this point, they're not saying someone's crazy. They're saying someone has possibly malicious intent, right? Because why is he lying about this? So that I think is a shift that really drives the clear with not so clear end of prophecy while there are prophets walking around, or people who call themselves prophets walking around.
So it was a
Yeah.
conspiracy of the psychiatrists were involved in that.
I remember in the DSM-4, because it used to be my father's a psychologist, it was our bathroom reading. Like, it's a great bathroom book. There's like these short little passages. You can read them very quickly. So anyway, at the back of the DSM-4, it has things from different cultures, right? How do you diagnose something when it's a different culture where different things are considered normal? And it was looking at an African culture, and a guy says he's a prophet. And if it were in America, you'd be like, this guy is crazy. He's having some kind of psychotic break. But in this culture, there are prophets. So is this guy normal, or is he having a psychotic break? And they're like, okay, well, in this culture, this is what prophets do. They talk this way. This is what they wear. This is how they act. This is how they get their prophecy. This guy is doing these other things. He's not doing these things like the other prophets. So yes, he has some kind of psychological problem, right? Because normal is whatever everyone's doing. That's the normal, right? So if you're in a world where people believe in prophecy and people get prophecies all the time, and someone gets a prophecy, you don't say you're having a psychotic break. You're like, okay, you're a person in this culture where everyone gets prophecy. So, and on that happy note, thank you for joining me and looking forward to seeing you next week. I will email everyone with what we're going to be learning. Have a good night.